Welcome to the Democracies College podcast series. This podcast focuses on educational equity, justice, and excellence for all students in P through 20 educational pathways. This podcast is a product of the Office of Community College Research and Leadership, or OCCRL, at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Learn more about OCCRL at occrl.illinois.edu. In this episode, Drs. Lorenzo D. Baber and Heather McCambly provide context on the origins and content of their book proposal and the eventually published volume titled Critiques for Transformation: Reimagining Colleges and Communities for Social Justice, a book that they and their colleagues developed during the trying years of the pandemic.
Hello, thank you for joining us today on Democracies College podcast. My name is Lorenzo Baber, Director of the Office of Community College Research and Leadership. In this episode, I am thrilled to be joined by my co-host, Heather McCambly, who is Assistant Professor of Higher Education at the University of Pittsburgh. And we are going to talk about our new co-edited volume, which came out in April, Critiques for Transformation: Reimagining Colleges and Communities for Social Justice. Heather, welcome. Thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm always excited to keep thinking and learning together. You always push me to figure out something new, so just don't push me too hard today. And y'all can find the book or the edited volume at infoagepress.com or through Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and other book selling providers of your choice.
Yeah, so again, we thank you in advance for your support in purchasing this volume. Hopefully it'll be useful for your own research or teaching or policy making as you move forward. Today, we just wanted to talk and provide a little bit of context about how we came to develop the book proposal and the volume, talk about insights on our overarching goal for the book, our conversations, which started years ago, pre-pandemic, about 4 years ago, feels a lot longer, but we continued it over the pandemic and other difficult times. We also want to talk a little bit about how we identified the topics and potential authors and think through together about how you may use the volume in your courses, in your policy development, in your discussions about theory to practice. This will be the first Democracies College podcast on the book, with future episodes focused on specific chapters with authors. So authors will join us on the podcast and talk a little deeper about their particular chapters. But this podcast, we want to kind of set the context for those future conversations and insights by giving a summary of the volume and chapter contents. As Heather mentioned, you can find the book on Information Age Press website or your preferred online vendors. Well, yeah, in 2019, actually, I just moved to Chicago, and Dr. McCambly was then a graduate student at Northwestern University. I was at Loyola, and we had known each other through actually work at OCCRL and our previous affiliations with OCCRL, and had kind of just started conversations. One thing I appreciate about Heather, she talks about me pushing her thoughts. Heather is a wonderful forward-thinking scholar. And so just talking through about some of the challenges for social justice work through policy and practice and post-secondary education, and kind of some of the major challenges. In the book, we kind of identified two major challenges that we wanted to address. And the first was the dominant framing of higher education as a neutral, apolitical space, crafted solely from principles of merit. And I would say that that challenge is actually more now than it was even 4 years ago. And then the second challenge we wanted to address is challenging the ideas that conversations about social justice and post-secondary education are often siloed by sector. So we have conversations among community colleges and then conversations among four-year institutions, but never together. We often think about it siloed by level of education, so undergraduate versus graduate, have siloed conversations around social justice among academic services, siloed from student services. So because higher education is such a vast terrain, that presents a unique challenge for understanding consistent threads of oppression that are situated across the complex system of colleges and universities. To address this challenge, we wanted to bring together a volume that kind of connected the silos together rather than tease them apart, in an effort to kind of deconstruct consistent oppressive norms of theory and practice and provide direction towards socially just reconsiderations across the various post-secondary contexts. Ultimately, we identified chapters that provided introduction of normative practices that reinforce material and cultural oppression, challenged those assumptions and then offered recommendations for redeveloping practices that center the well-being and success of all individuals, particularly students from underserved identities and those underserved by the practices that we highlight in each chapter. So the book itself is divided into 3 sections. And again, we emphasize not just critiques, but critiques for transformation. And so each of the sections starts with the thought about transforming. And so the first section is on transforming post-secondary pedagogies. The second section is focused on a set of chapters thinking about transforming campus and culture. And then finally, the third section is a set of chapters focused on transforming systems and structures. And through these sections, we bring together, again, critical scholars from across the country with varied research focus on post-secondary education in an effort to provide a comprehensive understanding of social justice across various educational contexts. That's just a little bit about our goals. And, as you purchase the book and read it, you can kind of re-listen to this podcast after you're done and see how well we did. But I want to turn over to Heather now to talk a little bit about insights of how we develop these conversations and how we use those conversations to develop this book.
I think it's interesting because when you kind of lay it out, it sounds really logical. It sounds sequential. But I remember what happened. I remember ASH 2019, we're at a reception in Portland. It was still at that point, you and Dr. Ebony Zamani Gallagher saying, hey, do you want to join us as a group of 3? She is now my dean here at the University of Pittsburgh.
Right. Shout out, Ebony. Love you.
And yes, we love you, all your support. And I was just like, I'm going to learn from the masters here. It's going to be amazing. And that was November. And so we had about 3 months where we started to hit the ground running. We would go to Emerald City Cafe in Chicago, best breakfast tacos, at least in the northern, in our area.
I'm a copy of the book because they definitely feel.
I know. They have books around too. We can be like, just put it in.
Right.
And at the time, I remember we were part of a series. We were supposed to be part of a series. Right. And the series really wanted us to have like kind of a P20 focus. So we were thinking about, okay, how do we want to do that? How do we want to bring authors together with a critical view? And we're making some good progress. And then March 2020 hit. And I believe shortly after the book series was canceled, if I remember correctly. Correct, and so because I'm your academic little sister, I'm just going to like bother you a little bit, like in true Lorenzo fashion. You were like, all right, well, that was fun. Never mind. I'm tired. And I was like truly stubborn. I was like, no, come on. You're like, all right. So we
persistent.
Kept going.
I will use the word persistent, not stubborn.
Persistent. Yeah. And then so that we had certain number of submissions that we already had on hand. So I remember we kind of looked at them and we're like, all right, we have Aaron Castro on deck, Aaron Doran, Rosie Perez, Raquel Rawl. And we're like, wow, this is like a dope group of early to mid-career scholars of color. And they're really united around using critical frameworks to push their areas of research in like really novel directions. They're all challenging constructs of power that often go unexamined. We're talking about boards, for example, right? This is right at the beginning of, Raquel Rawl, Dimitri Morgan, and others, Felicia Commodore coming in and saying, we got to look at this board composition and the power they have. And so we were kind of looking at that in light of what was going on in the summer of 2020 after the murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and too many others. Mm-hmm. And we're thinking, okay, so we're feeling a little useless here as academics. Mm-hmm. How do we push what critical research is for, right? What can it do that other forms of research can't? And how can we feel useful in this moment? I remember we were talking about something that had been on my mind that I've been thinking a lot from one of my femtors and incredible theoreticians, Dr. Shireen Vasugi at Northwestern University. And something she kind of instilled in us through her teaching and her writing is, if all we do is critique in critical research, we lose something. So how do we also dream and build while we do it? And so I remember we started to feel like, hey, that's something we could do in this volume. And I think that was kind of a turning point in how we brought everything together.
Yeah, those are really good points. And it's just like, it was a weird moment, right? Like we had these ideas, kind of got stopped by, nothing to do with us, but just kind of the context of the situation of what's going on around us. And again, I want to give you credit for, again, your persistence. You're right. I was kind of like, oh, well, we tried. I mean, circumstances were against us. Let's move forward with something else. And you're like, no, we've got something here. we got something to say. We've got some great folks around us who are forward thinking, who have this kind of radical imagination for thinking about not what is, but what could be. And again, moving beyond just identifying what is and critiquing what is, but really thinking about what could be and giving audiences an opportunity with tools, knowledge and tools to really transform, right? And so, I just want to say I appreciate it. The other thing I will say you won't say is that we actually did submit this to another publishing venue and they rejected us because they said it was too general, I believe. Like we were just going too
broad.
Remember that? Yeah, too broad.
Mm-hmm.
And then again, I was just kind of like, oh, okay, well, strike two. We tried again. It is what it is. And you're like, nope, we're going to try for something else. Again, I always appreciate your persistence and getting us through and pushing. And speaking of pushing, I think one of the things that's really valuable for this volume is the set of scholars that we identified. Again, forward-thinking folks who are really pushing the boundaries, scholarly boundaries in our field. We thought through people that we were connected with, as well as people that we had interacted with at ASH, at AERA, and kind of pitching our thoughts and them saying, yeah, this is something that is great. But even with that, some of the people that we know, as well as some people we don't know, but some of the people we know, even when they presented their abstracts, you're just kind of like, oh, wow, this is not even where I thought you were going, right? So I think about Deanne Squire, right, and Tara Milliken, co-author, and their work on decolonizing student affairs, right? And as a former student affairs professional myself, I was just kind of like, wow, I never thought about it in this capacity as a way of thinking about the normative features of student affairs and some of the practices that elevate kind of dehumanization through systems and processes and how to get past that. I thought was really, really insightful. And again, as I read the abstracts and then thought through about how amazing this volume could be, I think that's a great example, as well as identifying folks. And we both did this, folks that we knew, but the other person didn't know. So I think of Ariel Rogers, right, as a great example of that. I knew of Dr. Rogers' work, but that was your homie. And so when we got that initial chapter abstract on Black feminism and the work around curriculum, I was just blown away. One of the things that I really enjoy about this volume and putting it together is, like you said, we got a lot of early career and mid-career folks who aren't yet settled in the ways that they're thinking, right? And are really still thinking through the criticality that's needed to push higher education. And again, this was in 2019, 2020. So we also have to acknowledge the ways that they push through with all the challenges that are going on, both in terms of the pandemic, in terms of the just trauma, racialized violence, trans violence, other forms of violence against oppressed people, and even, going all the way to the January 6th, right? I remember, I think I was like reading a draft with the TV on thinking like, what a crazy time. And so I also acknowledge that our colleagues really pushed through and just created some meaningful pieces that I honestly think will stand the test of time, not only in the moment, but in the ways that future generations will say that, there were a group of scholars who were dreaming beyond what is and could think about what could be. And so hopefully it doesn't just get contained in that book, but then they can also think about ways in which this book helped elevate policy and practice through graduate education and through policy development. So I don't know, do you want to talk a little bit about how we think this can be used, this volume?
I also, as you were
audiences?
talking though, I was thinking about how, because you're right, I'm suddenly realizing like we didn't really have to chase anybody down for chapters. And we didn't have to do that much running after people, even about our peer reviews, which was unusual in the moment. I mean, we all saw like actual empirical papers coming out about how much that period of time was affecting delays in authorship, especially among women scholars, to be honest, right? Because we have a lot of caregiving duties. I know I did in that time. Because something I learned from our authors at AERA when we did that panel that I hadn't thought about from their perspective was the pieces that are in this volume were sort of like dream pieces for some of the folks, right? Like things that didn't have an exact home because they are kind of pushing the field in certain ways. And so there was kind of a lot of joy within our group at that AERA panel as we all discussed what it was like to produce this work and to have a home for it. It just makes me wonder, right, if the nature of it was part of what helped it not be such a painful process in a really painful time. So it's maybe something I'll ask folks later on.
Yeah, it was just felt like a good space to be in, right? Like whether we were just, focusing on reading drafts or talking with authors or talking with even the reviewers, it was a good space to be in. It kind of kept your mind into something that you knew was important, right? Even though there was chaos all around you and you kind of didn't know what the heck was going to happen. in all our other lives. But this was an opportunity to kind of say, with good people doing good work, taking good feedback, right, that we could kind of focus on this as a space we wanted to be a part of and actually we needed, right?
Yeah. And then we adjusted in our work on the intro and my work with Dr. Rogers on the conclusion. We were constantly, and I know the authors were too, kind of adapting to what we were learning. I mean, it's so funny that the fallout of some of the 2020 through 2022 period was all about learning loss.
Yeah.
When it's like, no, we all learned a lot. And our kids did too. So like, let's not, we won't even go there. But but I know we learned a lot, right? And that was getting kind of folded into the book. And so I think one of my, hopes and dreams for this book in terms of how it gets taken up, we're looking across different topics. So you're not going to find, all student affairs or all policy or all like pedagogy, but some of each. And thinking about it like this is a tool, I hope, right, for graduate students or research practitioners to sort of play and test out for themselves as they look at how are these scholars using theory and critical analysis in applied ways that carry political weight. For example, in our introduction, something that we wrote as we really digested the magnitude of the political backlash we were experiencing kind of in the wake of such powerful solidarity stands out to me. I just wanted to read it. In the intro, we said, this volume centers critical theories for the very reason that anti-equity proponents are frantically working to further obscure them, because we recognize that critical theories as analytic tools prompt us to ask, quote, different and perhaps better questions, end quote. That's from Lee Patel, 2021, about the oppressive systems in which we reside. This is a project of critical research and theorizing designed not merely to critique, but to imagine something beyond our current research. And then we start talking about history, right? We define criticality broadly as lenses on the world that help us get underneath or on the other side of the neoliberal post-secondary industrial complex marked by Reagan's 1968 speech. We deploy criticality because market-based economic lenses on human resource development fundamentally undermine our struggle towards transformative and humane futures. The neoliberal project encourages researchers, leaders, and students to keep their eye on individual gaps, limiting higher education's role to that of a mechanism for labor development. So I think we really kind of got into it about like, what have we been missing or what do we miss when we comply with kind of the neoliberal way of understanding higher ed research, right? In terms of employment, in terms of earnings, in terms of closing quote unquote achievement gaps. And I think we did a lot of work to that end in the volume. On the other end, like I'm still grappling with it. Yeah. I have practitioners when I do talks now kind of ask me, well, what do we do? Like I'm in Texas, I'm in Florida, I'm in North Carolina. Like, what do we do in the face of the fact that we're being told, shut down your equity, diversity, inclusion offices, don't talk about race, all of these things, the violence against transgender people, not only physically on campus, but through policy. And I think one of the things that I was learning as we worked on this volume and that I'm still trying to figure out how to talk about, and I know this might be something you can speak to, is the answer isn't in all of the kind of traditional ways we've been taught to think about quote unquote intervention in higher education, right? It's not a student bridge program, right? Like that's not going to cut it. It's about political organizing. And so as I think about as scholars, as teachers, as practitioners, how are we going to organize ourselves to be part of the pushback against the backlash? And, that's scary. That's hard work. But look, like I was looking at the news today, Florida University is set to approve the classical test. Have you looked at what's on the classical test? No. I mean, we're just getting like white heteronormative, like Judeo-Christian, not even Judeo-Christian, like ideology trying to replace the SAT. Things are getting wild. Like this is Reagan 2.0 on steroids. And it's like, yeah, this is political.
Yeah, it really goes back to the original point that higher education has never been a value neutral or politically neutral space, right? And also it's not a space that reflects the societal norms, right? That's another thing that people talk, and Isaac Gottesman, another chapter contributor, a historian, talks through that a little bit in his chapter, that higher education is complicit in the shaping of society, right? And so when we think about that over the last 50 years and, from the speech that kind of pushed higher education, a Reagan speech that many historians point to as the point of departure for higher education moving towards a, privatization, private good. as opposed to kind of a public space. And of course, that's overlapped with the kind of changing demographics of our society. So again, what college is for and who colleges are for, they're intersectional, right? They intersect. Like you said, that part, it should be less contested, but it is in terms of higher education being a apolitical, ahistorical space. So then it just becomes a terrain of like ideological battleground, right? Between equity and social justice and neoliberalism and capitalism. And certain institutions even have more pressure than others in terms of being those political and ideological battles because, the funding's tied to those things, right? As your work talks about in one of our chapters. And one of the things I enjoy about this book is that, this is what we think, right? But we're not also, it's not solid, right? So there's some things that we may have got right that others will extend on in a different direction. And there's some things that, we got wrong. And so, inviting people to critique the critique and filling in the gaps that existed, I think is also important. Again, towards the overall focus on equity and social justice as the space, as the place that higher education contributes to, I think it's important. It's odd that people think these things are new because they're not, right? And I know it's very frustrating. And I think sometimes, people might read this book and especially the recommendations and say, that's just a utopic view of what could be. But I think, we still have to maintain that even in the crazy times that we live in. And I think that one of the things that has fueled progress is hope. And certainly progress doesn't go as fast as we want. And we're not suggesting that. But that radical hope is what kind of sustains us in pushing that rock up the hill, right? Especially in a collective effort, which I think this volume represents in the moment.
I remember as Ariel and I were working on the conclusion, having read all of the chapters, we were thinking about this point about enacting radical hope. And I won't find it right now, and that doesn't matter. Y'all can find it and read it. But something really that we kind of sat with was, why do we stick with radical hope? What's the importance of dreaming? Yes, sometimes my students are like, okay, but is dreaming the opposite of practice? And it's like, absolutely not. It's the kind of forebear for it. I mean, when we think about whose reality are we living in right now, right? Someone dreamed this up. Like the reality that we're living in right now has so many components of Reagan era conservatives' dream of the types of metrics that higher education would be governed by. And we're only seeing that kind of getting pushed further and further in again today, even as we've taken some ground. So just remembering that a lot of the political tides we would push against, those were dreamed up too. We can stick with those as that's our reality. That's just, no, they dreamed it first. Right. And so if we're going to push back, we have to have a better vision than incremental change. So at least that's how I talk to students when they're like, I don't want to dream. I just need to practice. I'm like, these are not separate things.
Right. Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And it's a great place to maybe pause, at least for this episode. Do you want to talk a little bit about our plans for future episodes?
Yeah. So for the rest of this fall, so we'll also do a couple of podcasts in the spring, but for this fall, we have 2 additional podcast episodes that will be released. The next one is going to be a sit down between you, Lorenzo, and Dr. Isaac Gottesman from Connecticut College. He's going to join us to talk about his chapter on why history matters, critical approaches in higher education scholarship, which is just a beautiful and deep kind of dive into the multidisciplinary literatures and uses of different critical theories, with attention to critical race theory, which in education, sometimes we miss how far back and how broad this thing called, being critical is as a researcher. And so he kind of helps us get a little bit deeper than we often do into questions like, how are the critical ideas in my scholarship connected to a specific tradition of critical ideas? And how are the critical ideas in my work connected to the history of academic movements? And then also, how is my work connected to the history of struggle and social movements? And again, these are so oriented towards action and towards thinking about this connection of research to social action. And this kind of helps us engage with the political battles of the moment with fresh eyes. And then second, this fall, I will have the incredible pleasure of sitting down with Dr. Rosie Perez of Michigan and Dr. Ariel Rogers of Wisconsin-Madison to bring their work into conversation with each other. So for Rosie, this is her collaborative chapter with Claire Robbins, Cheryl Montgomery, and L. Wesley Harris on imagining U.S. graduate education in ways that integrate social identity, climate, and critical ways of knowing and engaging with equity and justice. And for Dr. Rogers, it's her chapter with Mary Sinyonga and Sarah Toutant using visionary fiction towards the praxis of Black feminism in higher education. These are both dope, incredible chapters, so I promise you the conversation is going to be fire.
I'm looking forward to listening to those, and I think it's going to be great. So again, Heather, thank you so much for joining us. And again, I want to remind the audience that Democracy's College podcast is sponsored by the Office of Community College Research and Leadership. This is just one of our series of podcasts. So we have a number of topics that we discuss and present across the P20 spectrum related to our work at OCCRL. And so we look forward to you joining us not only for this particular series, but also other podcasts from Democracy's College by OCCRL. But for now, again, thank you, Heather, for your time, and look forward to hearing those future podcasts. And everyone else who are listening, I hope you have a great day. Appreciate you spending time with us.
Bye.
Tune in for future Democracy's College podcasts that will go more in depth about the book Critiques for Transformation by covering specific book chapters by the authors who wrote them. The episodes will feature chapter authors Isaac Gottsman of Connecticut College, Rosemary Perez of the University of Michigan, and Ariel Rogers of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Background music for this podcast was provided by Fast Sounds from the website Pixabay. Thank you for listening and for your contributions to equity, justice, and excellence in education for all students.